want to say thank you so much for letting me have this opportunity to come along and speak to you all. As Christina introduced me, I'm Revati Campbell MSYP for Dundee West, but also convener of our Equalities and Human Rights Committee. So I would hope today to respond to all of you by taking a very general approach to my own personal ideologies on how to tackle inequalities, but also taking the Youth Parliament approach to that, as well as making direct reference to our current work dealing with the coronavirus currently. So I would say, to start us off, I want to talk a little bit about the issue of intersectionality, which a few of you have mentioned. Intersectionality is something that I very much use as an approach in all of my work, really wanting to take into account how every single minority group might be affected differently depending on the issue. And I think we could all probably say that social inequality is really an issue where intersectionality comes into play more so than other areas, that there are certain groups that will face more deprivation than others, or rather the way that that deprivation is experienced differs. So I think it's really important that no matter what research or conversation is having, is that you really have to consider those disparities between each group. In terms of responding to some of the um, the papers or the research talks before from other academics, I think it would be interesting to consider regarding the issue of the concept of social class and how family disadvantages might intersect with disadvantaged schools by looking at how you can apply non-Western ideologies that focus on collectivism, or rather look at issues of caste, which is a very different form of social class, I would argue, compared to what is currently existing in a lot of Western countries. Within the Youth Parliament, in partnership with our Education Committee and our Jobs, Economy and Work and Fair Work Committee, we've done a lot of campaigning around how to support young people through that transition from school to employment. And through that, that is looking at what are the different difficulties that young people are going to face. Again, looking at intersectionality, how a disabled young person is, what are they going to have to deal with, what barriers are they going to have to approach when transitioning into employment or further education? How is an immigrant child having to approach that situation? And a large part of that we have found is that there is a real lack of support in trying to combat those different barriers, particularly to do with financial issues, such as something as simple as covering UCAS costs. Some of you may know, some of you may not know, but you have to pay a cost to simply apply to go to university. And many young people, especially those living in areas of poverty, that is simply not an option. And we have policy on this that we would be wanting to support, that something like that is covered, to not have any young people disadvantaged from being applied to simply as university before even getting into university. Another issue that we've taken into account is around the issue of young carers. So kind of in regards to the issue of residential mobility, about that a lot of young carers are restricted in what universities they can apply to, and then subsequently the quality of education that they can apply to, because they are kind of stuck within one geographical area to do with caring roles. And similarly to do with actually with young people who are in the care system, so that's two different things, but there is a very much a geographical lock that they're in, and really wanting to find other ways that we can work with decision makers and various organizations to support those young people to not have to have those restraints. Additionally, looking at the issue of disabled young people, trying to look, there are really there's lots of research around the fact that young disabled people are simply not getting into university, or rather are not being encouraged to apply for those institutions or other further education, other areas of employment, because they are being seen as burdens or as disposable, not worthy of that education. And a part of that is looking into what support are they currently receiving in schools, but then also looking at what support are they getting to transition into the next level. And a part of that is trying to look into levels of additional support needs, but also really wanting to challenge the way that we view disability and also view young people, and how those two aspects intersect. Within the Youth Parliament, we very much are very strong supporters of the UNCRC bill, so the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child bill, which some of you may know has now been, or is in the process of being incorporated into Scots law. Our values are very much held around Article 12, which is around the right for young people to have views and to express them freely. And part of that is that we want to really call on decision makers and organizations and yourself as researchers and people who are investigating issues to do with young people, is that it's really important that children and young people are at the table and are a part of those conversations. Inclusion Scotland's slogan is nothing about us without us, and that is something that we very much apply in everything that we do as well. That these conversations, these researches, whatever it might be, have to be accessible to young people. There have to be some ways for us to come along and be heard in those conversations and be able to engage in them effectively. Something like this is such an amazing opportunity for me to come along to, but I cannot say that every single young person would be able to engage in an environment like this, or some of the language and certain templates and just resources used may not be accessible to young people. SYP's manifesto for the 2021 to 2026 is being launched tomorrow, coincidentally, and a part of that, the thing that really underpins that whole manifesto, is around ensuring that decision makers are listening to children and young people from what we call seldom heard groups specifically. So that could range from disabled young people to children of armed forces, those who are of the traveller community, those who are young carers, and it's really about not just looking at the main protected characteristics that the Equalities Act outlines, but really going into the nitty-gritty specific communities that might be ostracized from certain conversations. I realize that this is particularly around social inequality as opposed to inequalities across the board, but I think that one of the biggest issues at the moment, why there are still so many discrepancies and where certain legislation and resources are failing, is that too many of those sources are taking blanket approaches. They're taking these very general approaches to cover the bases. And unfortunately, when you do that, you lose the very specific issues and lived experiences that intersectionality discusses, and they get lost in that noise and rubble. And unfortunately, then you aren't covering what actually needs to be covered. By covering your bases, you're covering nothing. And it's really, really, really important that by bringing the voices of children and young people, you're not just taking that as a general approach. You're actually looking at making sure that you have Asian young people at the table. You have young people who are care experienced. You have those who are disabled into the conversation. In terms of, again, kind of leading back to the issue of poverty, we found that a lot of young people are really only going to schools to access food, because as we all know, poverty in terms and food inequality is a really big issue at the moment, especially has been exacerbated during COVID. And so we've had a lot of concerns around how this is going to work in terms of university and further education and employment if there is not that incentive to go get an education and go to other fields. And again, that kind of leads back to my point about really wanting to support young people in why education is an important necessity in our life, why movement is an important necessity in our life. With our Justice Committee and also with the Equalities Committee that I run, we've looked at issues around exclusion and young offenders and how, I guess, for lack of a better word, that criminal stigma that comes with young offenders kind of follows them through the rest of their life, and that we found that a lot of young offenders or young people who have a history of offending have really struggled to transition into employment and also into education. And we have our last manifesto, which is so not the one that's about to come out tomorrow, really was looking at how there's a real lack of education and training to help these young people reintegrate back into society, and that they're really being left behind rather. And I mean, there's a real range of issues I could probably cover here because it's young people and we don't all fall under one hat, but I would say that it is really important that we're looking at wanting to protect young people's rights and uplifting their voices in these conversations. And that it's not always having to call on us to be in that conversation. I think there's often, I'll be the first one to put my hand up and say that inequalities legislation has been really important and made serious strides, but unfortunately, a lot of that legislation still puts the responsibility on the people that it affects to take those actions to change things, as opposed to assessing and looking at why that legislation and those resources had to be implemented in the first place. So in terms of all the research that's been covered here, I think a lot of it's really, really interesting, and I've enjoyed listening to everyone's talks. But there needs to be conversations about why do these exist in the first place, as opposed to what does it presently look like, and how can we combat that. I think there needs to kind of go back to a ground zero, looking at the way that we view poverty in our culture and how we view young people's relation to poverty.